Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There has been no relief for the Prime Minister this morning as the Brexit pressure continues to pile up from all sides. A leaked Whitehall document which says the UK's economy will suffer no matter what trade deals are struck when it leaves the EU appeared online overnight at BuzzFeed. And this comes amid reports of senior Conservative donors calling for Theresa May to stand down. Our political correspondent Tom Rayner is in Downing Street where the weekly cabinet meeting is taking place. Tom, let's talk about these BuzzFeed leaks. I mean, what simply do they say? Because no one is disputing that these are genuine documents.
No, that isn't being disputed, Adam. What the government sources are saying is that it's an early draft and that there are lots of assumptions and caveats involved in this document. But what it's saying is that of three various scenarios, there is an economic negative impact in all of them. It says that if there was continued single market access, that it would see growth 2% lower over 15 years than had currently been predicted. If there was a free trade agreement, it would be 5% lower. And if the UK were to leave the European Union on World Trade Organization terms, that it would be 8% down. So pretty damning. But government sources are saying that this is not analysis of what the government's preferred option is, which is that idea of a bespoke relationship as outlined in the Florence speech, something that was neither the Canada Free Trade Agreement or the Norway single market access. It has nonetheless led to perhaps some predictable responses from Remainers saying, look, we told you so, this is vindication, and from Brexiteers saying we've heard this kind of speculation before, that we shouldn't take too much notice of particularly long-term analysis, and that's kind of what you heard there from Jacob Rees-Mogg. But will this do anything to reduce the divisions in Cabinet? No, it won't. I think what we should pick up as significant from Mr Rees-Mogg's comments earlier on Sunrise is that he clearly feels that the way forward, the way that the Brexiteers can voice their anger is to isolate the Chancellor Philip Hammond, to make him the focus of whatever frustration is building up about the direction of Brexit. But even if, as he seemed to intimate, although he seemed a bit too polite to say it outright, he wants to see Theresa May sack the Chancellor, there's very little likelihood that that in the end would be the answer to all the Brexiteers' problems, because of course you've got Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, David Lidington in the Cabinet Office, all of whom are thought to sympathise with holding the access to European markets as a greater priority than that Brexiteer priority, which is put forward by people like the Foreign Secretary, people like Michael Gove, Liam Fox, which is to ensure that there is freedom to strike trade deals around the world. So I think the focus on Philip Hammond's interesting, but it won't ultimately, even if he were to be sacked, as the Brexiteers seem to want, necessarily resolve the divisions in the Cabinet.
Tom, thanks very much indeed.
Now, Theresa May chaired Cabinet this morning, and I would imagine there was quite a bit to talk about. She is due to embark on a business trip to China, but troubles over the Prime Minister's Brexit policy persist at home. Leaked Whitehall analysis published by BuzzFeed News says that the UK economy will grow more slowly outside the EU, no matter what deal is struck with Brussels. Some Brexit-supporting MPs swiftly rejected the findings, with the likes of Ian Duncan-Smith calling it incomplete and deliberately leaked because it gives a bad view. Government sources say that its preferred bespoke trade deal option wasn't included and that the UK will not be worse off outside the EU. Meanwhile, the Sun newspaper reports comments from the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox that Eurosceptic colleagues need to live with disappointment and accept that the Tories don't have a working majority. Dr Fox has since issued a clarification saying that his comments were instead directed against those plotting against Mrs May. It comes as the government prepares for a legislative showdown in the Lords, where the EU withdrawal bill is set to be debated for the first time. Almost 200 peers are expected to speak in the debate, although no votes are expected to take place until later next month. In Brussels, meanwhile, the EU agreed its negotiating guidelines for the transition period. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said the UK would continue to accept all EU rules, including rule changes adopted after March 2019, but that it would not be involved in any decision-making. Downing Street, however, insists there will be a negotiation on the transition period. Well, joining us now is the Conservative MP Stephen Hammond, who lost his job as Vice-Chairman of the party after he rebelled against the government and voted for an amendment to the EU withdrawal bill calling for a meaningful vote. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Let's talk about the analysis that's been leaked. Before the referendum, George Osborne, the then Chancellor, based on Treasury analysis, told us a vote to leave would spark a year-long recession. It would cost 820,000 jobs within 2 years. And David Cameron said Brexit would put a bomb under the British economy. Those fears were wrong then. Why shouldn't they be wrong now?
Well, those fears were wrong then, and I'm pleased that so many people stay in their jobs. But the last set of economic news showed slightly better growth, also showed that we'd gone from the fastest growing to the slowest growing economy around. And also it showed, of course, that we saw the slowest growth for 5 years. The reason why I think this is embarrassing for the government today is that, first of all, this was a confidential crossed Whitehall paper that was shown to ministers confidentially, so someone's leaked it. That's embarrassing. And secondly, it does show a consensus that whatever option you look at, unfortunately, our economy will grow less fast when we leave the EU.
Right, and you've talked about the leak and how embarrassing it is. Isn't it suspect, the timing of the leak? I mean, Nigel Evans, one of your colleagues, says it's part of a dirty tricks campaign leaked by someone who wants the softest of Brexit.
Well, Nigel, I'm not going to comment on what Nigel said. I don't think it's a piece of paper that's just started round Whitehall. I don't know why it was leaked. But what we should be looking at is what it actually says. And what it actually says, under whatever option you choose to look at, and whichever one they've modelled, the UK economy will grow less strongly than had otherwise happened.
But you yourself have said that the initial fears that were warned by politicians in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit and EU referendum, they haven't been realised. So, I mean, how strongly can you believe that predictions made for 15 years' time are highly speculative?
Well, of course, you can't be absolutely precise about any detail in any forecast of anything.
Right. So we shouldn't take much notice of it.
Hold on. There is a really important point here. First of all, this is not one department like it was last time. This is economists looking at all departments, so it's a much wider range of economists agreeing. Whichever option you leave, the trend is clear. So it may or may, whatever you say about the absolute detail, the trend is clear here. And that's what should be worrying everyone out there, but also should be worrying the policymakers in government to make sure that we get a Brexit that works for Britain.
Right, but if you say the detail, and the detail's important here when we're talking about whether the economy will grow more slowly than predicted, we're supposed to believe that the Treasury can accurately predict something 15 years in advance. And yet this report has already changed from the one issued before the referendum. So they've already revised down the warnings.
Well, this is a new report, as I understand it. And for goodness sake, the whole point that we should now be saying, of course, is that the government must now publish this so we can actually see the detail, so that you and I don't have to speculate on it. But this is a new report looking at the latest information compiled by economists from as many departments as I understand that exist across Whitehall. And the trend is very clear here, and it's a worrying trend. And therefore, what we must want to see is the government to look at an option that keeps Britain in a customs union or EFTA.
Right. Isn't it important, though, to realise, you say there is a clear trend, but not one of the models that has been set out actually includes the one where Britain negotiates a bespoke, a tailor-made deal. That hasn't been included, so...
Well, no, that's true. But what, of course, has been modelled, according to the leaks, is a comprehensive free trade deal with the EU, which presumably is what that model will be. And it has also modelled the benefits of doing outside deals. It says that the economy will grow less slowly under a comprehensive free trade deal by 2%, and the benefits of those trade deals will be 0.6%. So even if you take that, what you've suggested isn't there at the moment. It doesn't look great at the moment. However, the government can resolve this quite easily by publishing the analysis and also telling people what it actually wants in its bespoke deal.
Right. Well, what do you want the government to do now on the basis of this information? What do you think should happen?
Well, I want the government to negotiate a bespoke deal, but I want that deal to ensure that we have closely aligned regulatory equivalents for financial services, which are our biggest earner. I want to see us in a customs union that allows us to trade freely still with our European colleagues, but allows us also to look at some of those relatively small but worthwhile benefits from outside trade deals.
Do you think we're getting closer to a position where the public should be consulted again?
I don't. I think a lot of the public want the government to set out its direction and are willing the government to get on with this and do it well.
Right, but the answer to my question, do you think we're moving closer to a position where the public...
Well, there will be... lots of people have called for that since we've had the first referendum. I'm certainly not calling for that. What I'd like, though, is the government to look at a comprehensive deal that keeps Britain in a customs union and allows us to make sure that we're closely aligned with the EU regulatory system so that our services industry can continue to prosper.
But, Stephen Hammond, people out there heard the doom and gloom that was given to them in the run-up to the EU referendum, and they still voted to leave in defiance of all those warnings and the forecasts. Do you think this will really change their minds?
Well, people out there were told there was going to be £330 million for the NHS a week, and that clearly wasn't right either. And so I think a lot of people voted on that basis.
Do you agree with your colleague Anna Soubry that Theresa May needs to control and get a grip of the arch Eurosceptics in your party?
Well, I think where Anna's right is that it would be helpful for the government to set out its position so everybody can be clear what its position is. And I hope that that position will be that the government rejects a hard Brexit and opts for a Brexit that is in the economic prosperity of this country.
Do you still have faith in Theresa May to negotiate the best deal for Britain?
I am clear that Mrs May has the option to do so and will do so. And I'm clear that that deal should be a customs union, closely regulated, close regulatory equivalence, and so that we can get the best economic outcome for the people. We want people to have secure jobs post-Brexit, opportunity of a good future and a better Britain.
Right, you don't sound totally convinced that Theresa May is the best equipped to actually negotiate what will be a very difficult trade deal with the EU.
Well, I think that was a pre-scripted question. I think I was pretty unequivocal, frankly.
Right, so she's got your full support?
I want the Prime Minister to succeed.
Right, and should she name her departure date to help bring and unify the party?
Only if she judges that to unify the party.
And what do you think?
Well, I think that there has been a lot of speculation about that. I think the Prime Minister may wish to make her intentions clear.
All right. Stephen Hammond, thank you very much. Well, Conservative MP and leading Eurosceptic Bernard Jenkin is with me now. Bernard, it looks like the government's been sitting on this report, and you can see why. I mean, it's pretty damning in every respect as far as the economy is concerned for Brexit.
Well, I mean, we've been here before. I mean, to some extent, I don't entirely blame the BBC for this, but government economists think Brexit is bad for Britain. You know, it's not exactly a very big story, is it? They were wrong, as you pointed out in your interview with Stephen. Completely wrong. I mean, we didn't lose 800,000 jobs. We've more or less created 800,000 jobs since the vote. The trend has been completely in the opposite direction. And yes, the economy's growth has slowed a bit, but that was after a long and sustained period of economic growth when the IMF, for example, was saying that George Osborne's policy was going to damage economic growth. These economists are so often wrong. Also, it's very important to understand the government uses what they call a gravity economic model. They factor in changes, but they don't factor in what the policy response is and what the other things the government might do to mitigate against those changes. And finally, I would just point out, actually, the government's policy, as they have said, is not reflected in any of these forecasts. Their objective of a bespoke deal, as you've pointed out.
Which I put to your colleague. But just because the forecasts were wrong in your mind during the referendum campaign doesn't actually mean that these ones are. No, it doesn't automatically follow, does it?
I can't absolutely prove that.
Right.
But on the basis of, you know, the 364 legendary economists who attacked Margaret Thatcher's economic policy in the early 1980s, they all proved to be wrong, and the government, you know, the Treasury at that time was very, very scared of Margaret Thatcher's economic policy. All the advice that the that the government got about what would happen to our economy if we didn't join the euro. They all proved wrong. I mean, you know, we know the British establishment has always had a pro-EU policy.
Right.
And they've always tried to prove the point by producing economic forecasts.
What do you say to that?
So where Bernard is broadly right is that actually the message that this will be bad for the economy has been very consistent. So prior to the referendum in April 2016, there was some forecasts that actually were sort of directionally the same as these forecasts now. So I agree. I'm not convinced this is hugely newsworthy in that sense. I think also if you look at what the Leave voters said, there was a poll of 12,000 Leave voters on the day of the referendum, and just 6% thought that there would be better economic prospects outside of the EU. Where Bernard, I think, is wrong is to somehow claim that putting up barriers between us and our largest trading partner, but not only doing that, also the EU has 50 trade deals around the world, and that's how we access those markets, that somehow that is going to be good for the economy. And I think what the consensus is amongst all economists, pretty much, with the exception of a very small number, is that this isn't going to be good for the British economy. And it's a perfectly respectable position to say it's not good for the economy, but there are other reasons to want to vote to leave. But I don't think you can sustain the position that somehow leaving the European Union is in our economic interest. You may say other arguments, you know, are more important than that, but it's hard to sustain that point of view.
Do you accept that on the economic argument, Brexit doesn't present a convincing case?
Well, people who are against leaving the European Union constantly attribute to us things that we haven't said. We don't want to put up unnecessary barriers to trade with the EU. That is not what the government wants. It's not what anyone who supported leave wants. And if there are barriers between our trade, it's because they're going to be erected by the EU. Now, that may be a consequence of us leaving. But yes, you're right. In the end, people voted leave because they wanted to take back control.
So
and that is not that is.
Can I pick you up on that?
But if we are perfectly capable of taking back control of our own destiny and making the most of our economic opportunities, and personally, I have complete confidence in the future of this country.
Even when Liam Fox,
even
when Liam Fox, your colleague, who is broadly on the same side as you and who is scoping out free trade deals once we leave the European Union, has said you need to prepare yourself for disappointment because you're not going to get the vision. Well,
he said he was talking about something else. I don't know what he really means by that. He certainly hasn't made a speech or made a big pronouncement.
Do you think he would be wrong if he was saying... I mean, will you take his advice? I mean, are you worried about this idea of having to accept a softer Brexit?
I have no idea what he meant by that. I think he's being misinterpreted. I mean, let him come on the television and say leaving the EU is going to be bad for the economy. I don't think he will say that.
He didn't say leaving the EU.
Exactly.
Well, I haven't said that. What he did say is,
well, then what does
reportedly, is preparing. You need to prepare yourselves for a disappointment and have to accept a softer Brexit.
I think what he may have been talking about is that we have to accept that there will be a protracted and rather unpleasant transition period, implementation period, when we're going to have to accept quite a lot of unpalatable restrictions on what we can do.
And will you accept it?
We're going to have to pay this money. Well, so long as we get out at the end of it, full regulatory autonomy, the ability to do trade deals with other countries, I think then we will arrive at the end of it in the best possible position, because we don't want to sort of poke two fingers in the rest of the eyes of the European Union. We want to leave on amicable terms, and we want to leave on terms where there is cooperation.
So you will accept their negotiating position of Britain having to abide by new rules during that transition period, and will have no input in the decision-making?
I support the Prime Minister rather more unambiguously than Stephen Hammond, who he wants to be in a customs union when we come out of the European Union. Actually, to be in a customs union or the customs union is frankly a distinction without a difference. And I agree with the Prime Minister, who has rejected the government's the EU guidelines produced yesterday. She does not want to be unambiguously unqualified rule taker during that transition period. She does not want to have untrammelled free movement of people during the transition period. She has rejected what the EU has offered yesterday.
So you're not concerned?
That's actually a much bigger story than this non-story about what a few government economists think.
Well, if it is a non-story, do you think it should all be published? And then we can see with the methodology.
Of course it should be published, and then we'll be able to see exactly what methodology they've used. This is what the government did not do during the referendum. George Osborne and David Cameron, they did not produce the methodology of their forecasts. We had to work them out or dig them out. And we found out that they too had used this gravity economic model that led to these very jaundiced forecasts, because their forecasts assume no policy response.
Well, why
it is a matter of economic debate that we can have as to whether, you know, this is going to be negative for the British economy.
All right, so you want it published. I mean, why hasn't the government published it? I mean, do you think this has been leaked in terms of a dirty tricks campaign?
I don't think the government had any intention of publishing it. I suspect a minister, a SPAD or an official has leaked this, not published it, in order to try and carry on the fear campaign that has been, I mean, much of the government seems to be still promoting the fear campaign, which of course didn't win with the referendum for the very reasons that have just been described, because actually people were thinking about constitutional and democratic factors as much as economic factors.
Is there a drift towards a softer Brexit?
Well, I don't think from the Prime Minister. Nothing the Prime Minister has
But is
said.
there a general drift towards...
I think there are people in the government, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as we said last Friday, who are trying to blow government policy in a different direction. I think this is the terrible difficulty the Prime Minister is having. But coming back to, you know, where the Conservative Party sits on this, the vast majority of Conservative MPs, like I think the vast majority of people in business in this country, want us to get on with this, want to reduce the period of uncertainty to as limited a period as possible, and get on with availing ourselves of the opportunities. They don't want this dragged out year after year after year.
I mean, so there is just no majority in Parliament for a Brexit at any cost, this sort of ultra-hard Brexit. So I think that's the problem that Bernard is picking up on. There's no majority in Parliament for that position, but the Conservative Party doesn't have a majority that is strong enough to just push through any particular single position. You're seeing that impasse between those people who say we must compromise and those people who say no compromise. And there's not much of a compromise between no compromise and a compromise.
Well, can I just deal with that? Because you see, what will keep the Conservative Party in office is broad unity in the Conservative Party. There are far more people who are broadly sympathetic to my view in the Conservative Party.
But you're the one who's also been attacking the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, and that doesn't help unity either.
I think the problem that the Prime Minister somewhat made for herself is that the majority of people in the Cabinet, she does not actually have a majority for her policy in her Cabinet. And I think that is making life very difficult for her.
You need unity in the Conservative Party, and then you've just been pointing out the divisions with it.
I mean, actually, that
is slightly surreal.
The balance of opinion in the Cabinet does not reflect the balance of opinion in the Parliamentary Party.
Well, when did Philip Hammond say he didn't want to leave the single market and the customs union?
Well, he praised the speech of the... Let's not go over this again, but he praised the speech of the CBI, which was unambiguously arguing that we should remain in a customs union. And you've just heard Stephen Hammond saying he's promoting that policy. That is not the policy of the government. It's not the policy of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has never hinted that we will be in a customs union after we've finally gone through the implementation.
Do you think that could be the end result, though?
So I do. I mean, before Christmas, IPPR published its proposal for the shared market, said we should be in a customs union and align our regulatory regime to the single market. That's since been adopted by the CBI as their position.
Well, the CBI
split others talking about that position. I think that's probably where we'll land if we decide that we want to honour the referendum result whilst also securing the economy. And that seems like a very reasonable...
And what will you do if that is... Well, what will you do if that happens?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when Jeremy Hunt wrote an article just after the referendum result, he made it clear that if we were to finish up in something like this Norway model, then there would have to be another referendum.
And do you agree?
Well, I think if the government is going to reverse the substantive decision taken by the British people that we would leave the European Union, leave the single market, leave the customs union, all the policies the government set out in the Lancaster House speech, all the policies that were in our manifesto, if we're going to reverse all that, it will cause some ructions. It will cause some serious disturbance. And just bear this in mind. One thing that we've seen is basically UKIP is destroyed because the referendum has decided this matter. But if the government, the great British establishment, starts dragging this back to some half-in, half-out, botched Brexit, there's going to be a very unhappy political situation in this whole country. The Conservatives...
What do you say? There'll be the end of the Conservative Party?
The vast majority of the Conservative Party are aligned with the majority of the British people, and I believe the majority of real business people, not these sort of...
But are you saying it will mark the end of the Conservative Party in government?
I think that, I mean, this is obviously very existential stuff. for political parties. I mean, it's certainly the divisions in the Labour Party are just as serious as in the Conservative Party. But when you say there's no majority in the House of Commons for what you call a hard Brexit, for honouring the result of the referendum, actually there was no majority in Parliament before the referendum for leaving the European Union at all.
All right, on that...
Is that the opinion that's going to be reflected in what the outcome is? No, I think the Conservative Party reflects public opinion. The vast majority of us are united about that, and I think we'll produce a majority in Parliament in order to be able to implement it.
Bernard Jenkin, thank you. Now, while all this is going on, the European Withdrawal Bill has its second reading in the Lords today and tomorrow. It's going to be a busy couple of days with around 200 Lords scheduled to speak. Many Brexit supporters have expressed concerns that the Lords, which is packed full of pro-EU peers, could try to scupper the bill. The session started just over an hour ago, and here's a flavour of what's been said so far.
My Lords, this bill is not about revisiting the arguments of the referendum. It is not about our future relationship with the EU, nor is it a vehicle for policy change. It is only part of the programme of legislation required to honour the referendum result.
Just as the first say on Brexit was given to the people, so the final say should rest with the people once they see the terms proposed by the government. Our constitutional role, my Lords, is to ensure with the House of Commons that the people have the final say.
At a time when the country really needs strong and stable government, we have instead consistent and persistent reports of a weak Prime Minister buffeted from one position to another as she tries to bring order to the warring factions in her cabinet.
Well, I'm joined from Central Lobby by Baroness Angela Smith, who's the Labour leader in the Lords, and by the Conservative peer, Lord Michael Forsyth. Welcome to both of you. Michael Forsyth, first of all, is the bill as it currently stands constitutionally unacceptable, as a committee of your colleagues has warned?
Well, if you read the rest of the sentence in that excellent report from the Constitution Committee, it says that it's capable of, it's necessary and it's capable of being amended to be effective, and I'm sure that's what the House of Lords will do, and we've got off to a very good start this morning. Both speeches from both front benches indicated we were determined not to delay or defeat Brexit, but actually to make sure that the bill, which is about bringing European legislation into our domestic law, was consistent with our constitutional requirements and able to be done effectively. And I have to say there is a lot to be done.
Angela Smith, what changes do you want to see made in the Lords?
Well, I think they're quite significant changes, as recognised in the debate today from all sides of the debate. So basically, let's get this transitional arrangements really sorted out. There's the issue of devolution of the government taking powers that should rightly be going back to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. One, I think, theme that runs through this legislation that across the House there's real concern is what's known as Henry VIII powers. And that means if we're taking these laws back into the UK, they should be under Parliament, not to be able to be lost at the sort of whim of or stroke of a ministerial pen. So it's the constitutional issues. For most people, this bill is really boring. It's not really about Brexit in the sense of whether or not it happens, but how we bring those laws that we've benefited for and contributed to over the last 40 years back into UK law.
Right.
So it's actually quite techie in getting this right. So
well,
it's
except
very
there is
legal.
there is a principle, though, isn't there, at the heart,
Absolutely.
as you say, about how much power the executive should have. And Michael
Absolutely.
Forsyth, your colleague in the Lords, Ros Altman, says tackling the controversial Henry VIII powers clause, because this is not a country where the executive is allowed to take decisions and override parliamentary scrutiny. At the moment, is that the case?
Well, you have to laugh at the irony of her position, because of course at the moment these powers are exercised by unelected commissioners in Europe. What we're doing is moving from a situation where regulation governs this country over which Parliament does not have a veto to one where Parliament will be able to decide these matters. And that is quite a tricky thing to do, because we're having to take regulations which perhaps are not in statute or have been made at a European level and translate these into domestic legislation. And after this bill has been passed, it will be possible once again for Parliament to decide every matter which affects our people.
And isn't that the point, Angela Smith?
Well, the point is that we have contributed to these laws. It's not just something that's been done by a stroke of a pen in Europe. There's been a British involvement in this legislation that we have welcomed. And quite often we've been the driver, particularly on environmental legislation and the rights of people at work. But Michael's absolutely right that if you bring them back into UK law, as we intend to do, And what you can't do then is say it's up to ministers at a whim to change them. It has to be a matter of Parliament. And if things are to improve, as Michael would argue, it has to be Parliament deciding and not just individuals.
Right.
I think there's agreement across the House on that. And that's why we will see significant changes in the bill in the Lords that were resisted in the Commons, but across all parties and none in the House of Lords. They recognise there are constitutional principles at stake here.
All right. I mean, Michael Forsyth, you say this is not, or rather, sorry, it was Angela Smith who said it wasn't really about Brexit. This is quite technical. But actually, the Labour Lord, Andrew Adonis, has claimed that he intends to sabotage Brexit. What do you say, Michael Forsyth?
I think he should, look to his position. We're not elected. The House of Commons has got to have the final say. He moved an amendment to second reading which provided for a second referendum. House of Lords considered that a year ago and it was defeated by a majority of 200. We recognise that the House of Lords is there to tidy up the mess which is left by the Commons often in legislation. And in this case there are serious matters. Andrew was quite right about Henry VIII powers, and I hope that the government will listen, and I hope that the bill will be amended and will go back to the House of Commons, and the House of Commons will take cognizance of quite good advice. But there is no appetite in the House of Lords on either side to challenge Brexit or to challenge the authority of the House of Commons, which is the elected House. Right.
How far is Labour prepared to go, Angela Smith, on the basis of what Andrew Adonis has said?
Well, Andrew Adonis himself has said he's trying to wreck Brexit in this bill. And actually this bill, even if you voted against it, all it would harm is the people who benefit from the protections that we've gained through Europe over a number of years. What we want to see is a bill that's fit for purpose. It puts those protections that we have fought for properly in UK law, and if there be change in the future, Parliament decides, not just a minister. So I think you're going to see significant amendments, and I also predict that you'll see support from all parties and none in the House of Lords and significant majorities.
Right. I mean, Angela Smith, Labour's campaign for the single market and open Britain have published a report today busting the Brexit myths, which calls for the Labour leadership to get off the fence on Brexit. Do you think that's what they should do?
Well, I don't think they're on the fence on Brexit, but I think it's always been said we're not in charge of the negotiations, Theresa May is. And one of the great, I think, shame of this is that Theresa May has ruled out the single market and the customs union before she even starts negotiations. So we have to recognise that if a decision is taken to come out of the EU, that means we come out of the single market and customs union. They're benefits of our membership, but we then renegotiate. And those are issues that have served us both very well in this country. So I'd like to see us renegotiate a position, certainly as close as we can, but certainly what we are saying is in the transition period we must have the same basic terms as now, and during that transition remain in the customs market, customs union and single market.
Right, well, Michael Forsyth, you don't agree with that, and you said to the Prime Minister that she needs to get a grip on her cabinet. Is the party falling apart over Europe?
I don't think the party is falling apart, but I mean on the issue of the customs union and the single market, the House of Commons voted on an SNP amendment by a majority of more than 200 against their proposal that we should remain in both. So the House of Commons has given a clear view, as have the people in the referendum, and it poses both Houses of Parliament to reflect that, and for the Cabinet to get behind the Prime Minister to deliver what the people voted for.
But these are still the negotiations that we're having about the future relationship with the EU 27 countries that remain. And what I find quite astounding is the one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the honesty of the debate. And I'm really quite concerned that we've heard today about impact assessments and analyses that are being done by the government that they're keeping from the public and from Parliament.
All right.
Decisions have to be made on our future relationship. They should be made on the basis of the facts.
Should they be published? Final thought, Michael Forsyth.
Well, I've got the Governor of the Bank of England coming to my committee this afternoon, and I'm going to ask him about these projections and proposals that have been put forward by the bank and the government as to what is going to happen to the economy, which have proved to be completely wrong. And I think we need to look at our forecasting models in this country, because I think they are destroying the credibility of not just the Treasury but also of the Bank of England.
Thank you to both of you.
The Brexit minister has rejected details of a leaked report about the negative economic impact of Brexit, saying it provides a selective interpretation of the research.
Steve Baker was answering an urgent question from Labour's shadow Brexit Secretary Sir Keir Starmer in the last half an hour or so. And the leaked Whitehall report found there was no scenario under which Britain would be better off after Brexit.
The government cannot be expected to put such analysis into the public domain before that analysis has been completed. That would misrepresent our views, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, the government cannot be expected to publish that analysis while the negotiations continue, which would surely harm the national interest. Parliament has rightfully agreed that ministers have a duty not to publish anything that could risk exposing our negotiating position. Now, let me turn to the article which has prompted this question. The article is a selective interpretation of a preliminary analysis. It is an attempt to undermine our exit from the European Union.
Live now to John Craig, who's in Westminster for us. And John, a lot of pressure building on Theresa May as she heads to China today.
Well, you heard Mr Baker there say that this is not the finished article, it's a draft, and he said it would be damaging to the public interest, the national interest, if the whole lot were to be published. This whole analysis has had a pretty sorry history. Back in December, David Davis at the Brexit Select Committee denied that they'd carried out any sector-by-sector assessments of the effect of Brexit. And yet here we are in this leaked analysis talking about the effect on the chemical industry, the car industry, textiles and so on. And that prompted Hilary Benn, who's the chairman of that committee, both in the chamber and also in an interview with Sky News in the last few minutes, really to question whether the information that the government has been giving, both back in December and again today, is accurate. He stopped short, of course, because it would be unparliamentary of accusing Mr Baker of telling porkies, but there was plenty of attacks on Mr Baker today. Second day running, we've had a junior minister standing in for David Davis at the dispatch box answering an urgent question. Ken Clarke, obviously a big pro-Remainer, the father of the House, was talking about the government's embarrassment. Sir Keir Starmer was saying the answers given by Mr Baker were not good enough. And clearly, this has been seized upon by the Remain campaigners. They're all basically saying, we told you so. Last night, when the leak happened, George Osborne, the former Chancellor, tweeted, gloating, you might say, gleefully, he tweeted, well, well. Well, you talk to Eurosceptics like Ian Duncan Smith, as I was a short time ago, and he said, well, you know, the Treasury's forecasts have never been accurate. This is the sort of propaganda we always get from the Treasury. So hardline Eurosceptics are dismissing it as yet more Project Fear propaganda. But of course, the pro-Remainer MPs are saying, look, we told you so. Meanwhile, while that was going on in the House of Commons, we've got in the House of Lords at the beginning of a two-day marathon debate on the second reading of the EU withdrawal bill. Now, at the moment, the Lords are not sitting. They have this lovely phrase in the House of Lords, adjourned during pleasure. That's a lunch break to you and me. But they are going on late tonight and again tomorrow. There is an attempt by the pro-Remain peer Lord Adonis to move an amendment, which is quite rare at second reading in the Lords, regretting that there is no provision for a second referendum. Now, he's probably not going to push that to a vote because the Labour front bench are not supporting him. The Lib Dems like the idea, but they're not sure it's the best way to do it. But we are seeing the beginning of what's going to be a couple of months of real warfare over Brexit in the House of Lords, which is probably going to end up with some amendments to the EU withdrawal bill being passed and, of course, putting the Lords on collision course with the Commons. Meanwhile, in the Commons today, MPs pro-Remain and pro-Leave, well, they're all colliding with each other anyway.
OK, John, thank you.
Let's show you the live pictures from the House of Commons. We were saying a few moments ago that in the House of Lords they've been debating the EU withdrawal bill. Here, Sir Keir Starmer, the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, put an urgent question to the government about this leaked report suggesting the cost to the economy of different scenarios involved in Brexit. Let's turn to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, who joins us now from Westminster. Sir Vince, welcome to you. The government's been pretty clear about this. The Prime Minister's spokesman has come on and said, look, this is an interim report. It completely ignores the fact we hope to get a bespoke deal. That's not been... There's no plot for that because we haven't got it yet.
Well, actually, that's not the case. I mean, to the extent to which we know what was done, and it's a leaked document, what it seems to suggest is that almost under any assumption, even if you take fairly optimistic assumptions about a new deal with the European Union, even if you look at new deals with other countries, on almost every exercise that the government ran with its own figures and its own economic model, the country would be significantly worse off. That was their own conclusion, and they clearly found that embarrassing, and they're very reluctant to publish it.
Should there be any more embarrassed the Treasury about this than suggesting that 500,000 jobs would be lost as a consequence of Brexit?
The Brexit, of course, hasn't happened.
They didn't say that, did they? They said,
well,
after the vote.
The arguments around the immediate impact of the Brexit vote are quite different issue from what we're talking about now, which is trying to look at the long term. And the model that was looked at here was looking over 15 years about how this would affect the real economy. Now, clearly, nobody can predict the future by definition, but you can try to do it scientifically rather than just blind guesswork, and this is what the government's own officials have been trying to do, and they're highly expert people, and their government hired them, and they could have revised it if they didn't like what they were doing. But their own figures, their own exercise, tends to show, what I think a lot of people have argued anyway, that on almost any assumption that you care to make, the country will be worse off as a result of leaving the European Union.
Don't a lot of leavers, even people like Gerard Lyon, say, if you look, we accept there'll be a short-term hit, maybe a medium-term hit, but the graph is that of a hockey stick. There will be a modest decline, but then there'll be a sharp uptick as we start signing those deals with parts of the world which have booming economies, unlike the EU.
Well, I'm familiar with hockey sticks, having been in the business world, and the question is whether they ever do turn upwards. And actually, this particular exercise was done over 15 years. We're not just talking about immediate impact. Now, of course,
looking 15 years into the future.
But of course, we need to have close relationships with the rest of the world, with China and India. But actually, that's what the government's been trying to do. The government I was part of, we spent an enormous amount of time in China and India. We can do that as members of the European Union. Leaving the European Union doesn't help us to do that. It actually makes it more difficult to do it because we've got less bargaining power. It's not obvious that that's going to make a difference. And even on very optimistic assumptions used in this exercise here, the gain from these new trade deals is only about a quarter of what you actually lost by the loss of access to the European Union.
Even setting aside cynicism about experts and forecasts, isn't the reality that a great many leavers actually this is not the priority for them. The priority for leavers, many leavers, was democratic issues, national identity issues, cultural issues, taking back control rather than boring old GDP.
Yeah, you're quite right. That is a totally legitimate argument. But I think a lot of people who voted Leave didn't realise or didn't anticipate that they were going to vote to make themselves poorer. It may be that some did, and that they were much more concerned about other things, and that's a perfectly honest and legitimate position. But just to establish where people really are coming from, I mean, we argue that my party argues that once the deal is known, we should have a vote to say to people, is this what you wanted, or would you rather stay within the European Union?
Have you been surprised by the excellence of the performance of the economy since Brexit? Because you could argue it's done far better than people predicted in the wake of the vote, and that's one of the reasons why you've got a lot of cynicism from leavers about studies like this.
Well, it hasn't collapsed. I mean, that's about the only thing you could say. I mean, it hasn't collapsed, and we've had very good employment figures, and the employment figures are a carryover from the coalition years when we got to full employment. What has happened, two things have happened. The first is that Britain has moved from being one of the best performing economies in the group of 7 developed countries to the least best performing. We're now being outperformed by the Eurozone. The other is the
Eurozone was due a bounce back, wasn't it?
Well, there was a bounce back anyway. We've also had a big devaluation, and that has had some positive side effects. It's helped to make exports more competitive, but it's also cut people's living standards, quite significantly over the last year. And as a result, there's been a reaction in terms of reduced consumer spending, more consumer borrowing. So although we haven't crashed, clearly, I mean, there hasn't been a complete collapse, and people were perhaps foolish in some cases to have predicted that. It certainly isn't a great success story.
Vince Cable, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let's get more on our top story, though. The pressure piling up on Theresa May. Joining us to talk about it in more detail, Labour MP Chuka Umunna, who's a leading supporter of Open Britain, and also Nigel Evans, who's Conservative MP and Brexiteer. Hello to you both. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Mr Evans, to you first of all. Oh, this latest report is not making good reading, is it? Maybe we should stay within the European Union after all.
No, do you know, they might as well publish the report now because it's clearly been leaked and we know why it's been leaked. But, Kay, it's not going to keep me awake at nights, this report, because I read the analysis of what the Treasury said would happen immediately should we vote to leave the European Union. And it is awful reading. This was published 1 month before the British people decided to leave the European Union. And it's either grim or very grim, whichever scenario you want to take, that unemployment is going to rise. We're going to go into an immediate recession. And growth is going to be cut. So basically, all the things that the Treasury said in May of 2016, this report now says today. I didn't believe what they were saying then, and I don't believe what they're saying now. It's the same methodology that they're using, and quite frankly, they've got a lot of questions to answer as to why they got it so miserably wrong in May 2016, and they're still doing their Project Fear.
Yeah, see, Chuka Umunna, you tried to scare us then, and you're trying to scare us now.
Well, let's actually deal with the facts. Of course, when we had the referendum in 2016, we were dealing with hypothetical. But the facts are now we've got 3% inflation, which means that your viewers are paying more for basic items in the shop like cereal, toast, butter, milk, eggs. And they've also faced a situation where they're not going to see their incomes getting to 2007 levels to 2025. So that's the reality of the economy at the moment. And that's before you look at the impact on public services. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies wasn't doing any projections. It was just reporting what's actually happening to the NHS as a result of inflation and the added cost. It's costing it £1 billion more a week because of the increase in inflation. So that's what's happening now. And I really find it quite extraordinary that you've got a Conservative MP beseeching his own Treasury's independent economic forecasts. And the interesting thing about this is, of course, the Department for Exiting the European Union is manned by Brexiter ministers who said that if we leave the European Union, everything will be wonderful and we will see growth growing at an extraordinary rate over the next few years. Of course, what these analyses show, which of course the government always denied existed, is that actually it's going to be the opposite. And worse than that, it shows that the least worst option, staying in the single market and the customs union, which has been voluntarily taken off the table by the Prime Minister, the least worst option we can't access now because she is refusing to take it.
OK. Nigel Evans, I think Chuka Umunna is having a pop at you.
Do you know, I don't mind, because the facts speak for themselves. And the report that I talked about said that unemployment would go up by 500,000. And in fact, unemployment has gone down every month since we voted to leave the European Union. And growth has been now escalated higher than they predicted to begin with as well. And the pound's back to $1.40. Do you know, I really don't care, because the fact is that Chuka must feel incredibly uncomfortable. On the Mar programme on Sunday, he talks about staying in the single market and staying in the customs union. His own leader, Jeremy Corbyn, declared on Sunday that that simply wasn't going to happen. So the Labour Party's official policy is no second referendum. We're going to leave the single market. We're going to leave the customs union. His leader actually accepts the verdict of the British people on June the 23rd, 2016. Chuka is looking for every opportunity to see how that they can stay in at least some semblance of the European Union. What you're seeing, Kay, is the death rattle of the Remain group, who are doing everything that they possibly can to thwart the wishes of the British people, and it's simply not going to work because every window is now closing upon them.
Death rattle,
well,
Chuka Umunna.
Unsurprisingly, I don't agree with that invective. Because, look, in the end, that 2016 referendum told us whether a majority of people who participated in it wanted to remain in the European Union or leave it. But it didn't tell us how people wanted to leave the European Union. And ultimately, whether you voted leave or remain, I don't think you wanted to leave in a way that made you poorer. And in respect of the Labour Party's position, I've been very clear. I hope that we adopt a position of single market membership and customs union membership, which are some of the economic structures of the European Union which you can continue to be part of after you've left. I think that's the best way to protect your viewers' jobs. Now, the Labour Party hasn't actually decided what it's going to do on that. On the Mar show this time round, at least I could give that to Nigel, our leader didn't actually give a clear answer to that question because we haven't actually decided what we're going to do. But I think this is a very serious matter, that these analyses, whether you think like Nigel, they're all a load of nonsense and we should ignore them, the British public deserve to see them. And that's why over 45 MPs, who are all part of the all-party parliamentary group on EU relations that I co-chair with the Conservative Anna Soubry, and other Conservatives are involved with this too, over 45 MPs have actually just sent a letter to David Davis, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, to come clean about what is going on here. We just had a minister answer and explain this leak, but he provided absolutely no answers at all. It was really quite a pathetic outing at the dispatch box for a Minister of State. And so you've got cross-party MPs from Labour, Conservative, Greens, SNPs, the Liberal Democrats, all writing to him saying, fess up, tell us what the situation is, answer our questions, stop withholding information from the public, which they deserve to know, to come to an informed decision about what happens at the end of this process.
OK, Nigel Evans, I wonder what you make of what Michel Barnier said yesterday, that we will still be remaining part of the European Union until 2020, but as of March next year, we won't have any voting rights, we'll still have to pay in. Why don't we just pause Article 50 so that we leave the European Union at the same time as we're not paying in anymore?
We're on the process now, Kay. We've triggered Article 50.
We can pause Article 50 at any stage, according to Dominic Grieve that we spoke to last night on this very programme.
Yeah, well, listen, Dominic Grieve wants to remain in the European Union.
Yeah, but in addition to that, he knows the law, and his view is, his legal view was, that we could pause it to the end of 2020. Why not at least do that?
You could pause it if you want to, but Dominic Grieve wants to stay in the European Union. He finds it impossible to come to terms with how the British people voted. So there we are. But I accept the view of the 52% of the people who decided to leave the European Union, and now let's just get on with it. And, you know, the one aspect of this leaked report, and Chuka, I'll sign that letter, by the way, they might as well publish that report because it will be as discredited as this Treasury document was as soon as we voted to leave the European Union. So by all means, publish it. But the one aspect which they've not looked at in all their analysis is the option of a British deal with the European Union. Now, we know that Chuck has been over to speak to Michel Barnier and have a private chat with him, along with a few other colleagues at the House of Commons. I think Dominic Grieve was part of that little group. And none of them are prepared to actually say what they said to him or what he said to them. So, Chuka, I mean, what did you say to Michel Barnier and what did he say to you?
OK, I ask the questions here, if you don't mind. I wonder...
I'm happy to answer if you want me to,
no,
please tell us.
Not particularly. As far as Theresa May is concerned, all this infighting in China, she's gone there. How long is she going to be the Prime Minister or otherwise? You guys must be delighted in the Labour Party. If you win a snap election, would you ask for another referendum?
Well, I think, well, I'm not sure we're going to have a snap election very soon, but my position on what happens at the end of the Brexit process is if Brexit in the form that it was sold to the British people ends up being materially different at the end of this process, so no £350 million extra per week going to the NHS, we don't enjoy the exact same economic benefits in the European Union as we will do outside of the European Union, and we don't strike all these magical trade deals with countries outside of the European Union. If all of that we were promised doesn't turn out to be the case, then I definitely think the British people have the right, given they started this process by voting to leave the European Union, to have a final say on the deal. And whether that's through a referendum or through a general election, I'm easy with either of those things. But we're not at the end of the process yet, but I certainly don't think we can set our face against that. And there's a lot of talk, you know, about thwarting the will of the people. I think at the end of the day, how can you thwart the will of the people if they get the final say? It shouldn't be a bunch of politicians in Westminster, some elite deciding all of this. Actually, the people started it, so let them finish the process.
Nigel Evans?
Yeah, we had a general election. It was early, it was not brilliant, but nonetheless, both political parties that gained 80% of the vote said that they accepted that we were leaving the European Union. Chuka, we're leaving, and I know that you would, you're not happy with that particular situation, but your own leader did make it absolutely clear on Mar that we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union. So I'm afraid
he He wasn't as clear as I would have liked to have been.
No, he was more clear than you. He was more clear than you'd liked him to be, and he's also ruled out the second referendum. So the next option is the general election when it comes. And what we've got is Theresa May in China with 50 top business people looking to see what trade deals are available between us and China. And I've got to say, this is going to be something that we couldn't do if we remained in the European Union, and that is doing independent trade deals with countries, major economies all over the world. We've just had Donald Trump and Theresa May meeting in Davos, and the one thing that President Trump said is we're doing a lot of deal with Britain, a lot of trade with Britain. We're going to want to do a lot more. That's something that was totally unavailable to us.
I'm not sure I want to put the future.
I'm not sure how far that will go, but sorry.
I'm not sure we want to put the future of our country in the hands of Donald Trump, honestly. If that's going to be Tory policy, they well and truly will lose that general election Nigel's talking about.
You're laughing, Nigel Evans. Is it a laughing
Yeah, I'm very
matter?
confident. I'm absolutely very confident. Do you know the major difference between the European Union and the United States of America for Britain? We have a £70 billion trade deficit with the European Union. We have a £50 billion trade surplus with the United States of America. So bring it on. And I believe that we can do much, much better with the United States of America and all those faster-growing economies outside of the sclerotic European Union. Bring it on.
Final thought from you.
Well, actually, many of those European economies are growing faster than the UK's at the moment. I mean, you know, this is some kind of slightly ludicrous, delirious view, but it's legitimate. I'll give him that.
OK, final thought from you, Nigel Evans. Your Prime Minister is as safe as houses, is she, at the moment?
I believe that I'm very confident that Theresa May, that there is absolutely no danger to her leadership whatsoever. Listen, I got elected, Kay, in 1992, and I remember that John Major put up with a lot of sniping over 5 years. What happened? We had a general election in 1997. He led us into it, and we had one of the biggest defeats. Now, you don't need to look into a crystal ball, just look into the history books, and I would say to the small number of my colleagues, for goodness sake, get behind your Prime Minister, show loyalty, and allow her to lead us out of the European Union, which the British people voted for on June the 23rd, 2016.
Final thought from you, Chucker, as I said.
Well, I think ultimately, as I've said, I mean, this isn't about the internal party politics of the Conservative Party. It's about future generations.
Kind of sort of is, though, isn't it, at the moment, to be fair?
Well, it shouldn't be. It should actually be about the country. And one of the things I admire in many people from different parties, that we've actually put our party political concerns to one side and we're seeking to work together in the national interest. And this is the biggest change in a generation. It's worrying a huge number of your viewers, and we've got to get it right. Okay. And we shouldn't be simply pursuing some course for some ideological reason. You do the best thing for Britain and try and get the best exit possible. And the British people reserved that to Parliament to decide, which is why it's right that we scrutinise what Theresa May's doing, not just rubber stamp it, which is what Nigel wants us to do.
OK, and Nigel Evans, if you keep mentioning other programmes on my programme in future, you're not coming back, I'm just telling you. Good to talk to both of you. Thanks.
I promise I'll never do it again.
We'll see about that. Thanks very much indeed, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Ministers have sought to play down a leaked government document that suggests the UK could be substantially economically worse off after Brexit. The analysis drawn up for the Department for Exiting the EU contains forecasts for 3 different outcomes, and all show a reduction in growth. The Brexit Minister, Steve Baker, said the document didn't take account, though, of the opportunities afforded by leaving the EU, and said such forecasts by civil servants were always wrong. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, reports.
Are you still in control of your party, Prime Minister?
That nagging question again. Theresa May's just getting on with the job, and today that meant meeting Estonia's leader. But Britain's leaving the EU, and Theresa May says the UK won't lose out when it does. She says she'll stay on through another election to see it, but some MPs have been airing public and private doubts about her future and Britain's after Brexit.
Is Brexit going to mean a poorer economy for the country? It's a lovely morning, isn't it? When will the government...
Cabinet ministers are to be shown a Whitehall assessment of how the UK economy might be held back.
Are we poorer as a result of Brexit?
Draft extracts had already leaked and been published by the news website BuzzFeed. The long-term Brexit projection suggests the economy could suffer maybe 8% lower growth if there's no EU deal and the UK trades on global or World Trade Organization rules. Growth could work out 5% lower if there's a free trade deal without single market membership. And 2% lower growth could result from an agreement to stay within the single market, a route taken by countries including Norway. But the government says it wants a trade deal as strong as Britain enjoys now, and claimed the leak had been used to damage the case for Brexit.
The article is a selective interpretation of a preliminary analysis. It is an attempt to undermine our exit from the European Union.
Brexiteers argued don't believe long-term forecasts.
We were told prior to the referendum by the Treasury that if we voted to leave we would enter immediate recession. The IMF told us that the economy would contract by as much as 9.5%. Both were made to look extremely foolish.
Critics on both sides wanted to see the report. They felt Brexit wasn't working.
Except that he's failed, actually, to try to protect the government from political embarrassment.
This is a cover-up, Mr. Speaker, pure and simple, and it stinks.
Today, the Bank of England governor told a committee of peers Brexit had been a drag on business.
Business investment is not up any way to the degree that a world economy growing at over 4% with the easiest financial conditions, most supportive financial conditions in over a decade, with the strongest balance sheets in probably 25 years, and with huge opportunities in an environment of greater certainty. It's not growing to that extent.
In the House of Lords, peers have begun to debate the bill bridging the way to Brexit. There'll be strong resistance and struggle for weeks, months to come. Meanwhile, there have been Tory calls for Mrs May and her government to show people the Tories are on their side.
If we are to ever have a chance of winning an election, we have to get back on this radical agenda and be a compassionate party, present ourselves as the party with a ladder of opportunity that people can climb to the very top.
No one knows how Brexit will turn out. The government's plan is still a work in progress. Negotiations have barely begun. Any new leader would have the same problems with Brexit and in Parliament. And anyway, there's no rival organised campaign. But privately, some Tories are saying they feel they can't go on with what they see as a lack of direction much longer. And I'm told some party donors are feeling just as unhappy. Theresa May set off tonight for a visit to China, an important part of the UK's post-Brexit plan. But leading Britain out, just leading her party, is turning out to be a tough challenge. So what could turn things round for Mrs May and her government? Well, an EU deal with no trade barriers. But so far, there's no sign of EU leaders accepting that. Just the opposite. If Brexit was to unravel, if the Tories were to suffer a bad set of local election results in May, if there were to be some unforeseen failure of command in Downing Street, any of these could cause a crisis for Theresa May. Tonight, she's off to China. Business as normal. But splits and infighting in the cabinet and downwards, that's become normal. And for Mrs May, leadership, well, that's become a rather precarious business.
John, thank you. John Pienaar. There is growing pressure on the government tonight to publish a leaked study on the economic impact of Brexit. As ITV News revealed last night, it predicts every part of the economy will suffer. But today, the Brexit minister tried to downplay its importance, while our political correspondent Carl Dinnan is in the House of Commons for us this evening. So, Carl, growing calls then for this document to be made public.
Yes, now that MPs know these new reports exist, they want their hands on the details. The headlines are that even if Britain stays very close to the EU, civil servants think the economy will be 2% smaller than it would have been. If we do a fairly standard trade deal, it'll be 5% smaller. And if we crash out without a deal, it could be 8% smaller, with the North East, the West Midlands and Northern Ireland all being hardest hit. Now, the Prime Minister was meeting her Estonian counterpart in Downing Street today, but shortly before that, she told Cabinet colleagues that these reports were incomplete. She said that was because they didn't include the kind of bespoke deal that she says the government wants to get from negotiations. And her ministers were involved in testy exchanges here in the House of Commons about the publication of the reports.
The article is a selective interpretation of a preliminary analysis. It is an attempt to undermine our exit from the European Union.
Not good enough. For the past year, we've called on the government to publish Brexit impact assessment. A simple argument. On decisions of this significance, Parliament is entitled to know the likely impact of the government's approach to Brexit and thus to hold the government to account. The government has refused repeatedly our requests.
So Labour will be trying to get their hands on these reports. If they succeed, they will find the Prime Minister is right. They won't include what would happen if we get that kind of bespoke deal that she says she wants, and that's because the government still hasn't decided what that bespoke deal would actually look like.
OK, Carl Dinnan in the Commons, thank you.
Now, it's been a long-standing battle. Pro-Remain MPs attempting to force the government to release analysis of the economic impact of Brexit. Today, they finally got some answers after parts of a highly confidential report were leaked to the website BuzzFeed News. And as our business editor Siobhan Kennedy reports, it gave a doom-laden prediction of what might happen to the economy after Brexit.
It was supposed to be so sensitive that ministers were only allowed to read it in a locked room and swear not to divulge its contents. But inevitably, the government's latest Brexit impact analysis has found its way into journalists' hands. And it makes for pretty uncomfortable reading.
During the referendum, Brexiteers told us that people had had enough of experts, particularly those telling us that Brexit would harm our economy. Yet today, in an embarrassing leak, it's emerged that the government's own economic experts still believe that under any scenario, Britain will be worse off once we leave the EU.
According to the report, under the softest Brexit option, continued access to the single market, UK growth would be 2% lower over the next 15 years. A comprehensive free trade agreement would result in a 5% dip, but a no-deal scenario would see growth reduced by as much as 8%. Hit hardest would be the North East, West Midlands and Northern Ireland, whilst cars, chemicals, clothing, manufacturing, food, drink and retail would be the parts of the economy worst affected under all three projections. In Parliament, the Brexit Minister Steve Baker appeared to dismiss the report's conclusions, despite the fact his own department had a hand in writing it.
These sorts of analysis have been proved to be wrong in the wake of the referendum, not least because there is huge uncertainty around any forecast, especially in the long run and especially in the context of a major strategic choice.
And there was none of the usual chirpy banter from Boris Johnson. He's lambasted the gloomy Brexit predictions, so-called Project Fear, ever since the referendum. Today, one of his favoured economists insisted the mathematical modelling behind the data was flawed.
Fundamentally, they just used the wrong methods. They got in a muddle, and it's a bit of a mess. If you put in the assumptions of free trade, and even if you put in, no deal, we're better off by 4% because we're doing free trade with the whole world, and that's the key point.
But only 1% of economists agree with that view, says Paul Johnson, one of the so-called experts that Brexiteers have sought to marginalise.
Well, essentially this document and the numbers in it are a statement of the pretty obvious. If you make trade more expensive with your biggest, richest and closest trading partner, you will be worse off. There is genuinely no question about that. The issue is how much worse off and what kind of deal we do end up with.
For business, today's revelations will come as no surprise. Many have argued before and since the referendum that close links to the EU are essential for continued long-term growth and prosperity, and anything that severs those links will hurt the economy. That's why many believe the government didn't want this data to come out.
Businessmen like Richard Reed, the founder of Innocent Smoothies and a prominent Remainer.
Well, I think it's just another fact in a series of facts that are coming to light that we didn't know about at the time of the referendum as a country. We didn't know that all the nurses were going to leave, but they're leaving. We didn't know that wages were going to fall in real terms, but they have. So today, to find out that the government itself is sitting on information which shows that in all scenarios Brexit is damaging to the economy, it ultimately doesn't surprise me. It depresses me, but it doesn't surprise me.
What this does show, though, is that the experts that advise the Remain camp also got it wrong. That the worst-case scenario that people like you and others painted, the hits to the economy that you all predicted, are nothing like as bad.
Yes, but that's proper nonsense for two reasons. Firstly, we were talking about the consequences of leaving the EU. We haven't left it yet, thank God. But secondly, what has happened economically since we voted to say that we will come out? We've gone from being the best performing economy in the G7 to literally the worst. We've gone from first to last.
That's a fact that Brexiteers can't dispute. As for that document, the government made no secret it doesn't include any assessment of its preferred option, a bespoke free trade deal just for the UK. But, so says the EU, that's not an option on their table.
A Tory lord who, until last summer, was one of Theresa May's Brexit ministers, today warned the Prime Minister that Britain will be walking a gangplank into thin air if the government doesn't decide what it actually wants out of Brexit. As the European Withdrawal Bill arrived in the House of Lords amid the high-profile Brexit leak, accusations of sabotage and cover-up flew in both houses. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
Where David Cameron liked Etonians in number 10, Theresa May today had an Estonian, Prime Minister of one of the EU's smallest states.
After the Brexit, we could find very strong ties and bridges between two countries.
Earlier, she told her cabinet that the Brexit forecast leaked to BuzzFeed were merely initial work, not approved by ministers.
Are we poorer as a result of Brexit, Prime Minister?
But in the House, the junior Brexit minister went further, suggesting the leak was an act of sabotage.
The article is a selective interpretation of a preliminary analysis. It is an attempt to undermine our exit from the European Union.
And Steve Baker said they'll publish proper economic forecasts when MPs vote on the final deal.
Not good enough.
Labour want the full report at once.
Will the Secretary of State now publish this now? Not in 9 months, but now, so that we can hold the government properly to account.
The leak of the Brexit forecast came only hours before the House of Lords today began the long, laborious process of considering the government's EU withdrawal bill, the legislation which formally will take us out of the European Union and transfer European laws and rules en bloc into British law. Pro-Remain forces are much stronger in the Lords than they are in the Commons, and the temptation will be for peers not to block the bill, but certainly to bash it about a lot with significant amendments. The former Labour minister Andrew Adonis wants to give the British public a second referendum.
That the interests of the public as a whole do not lie in making Britain poorer. They do not lie in undermining the Good Friday agreements. They do not lie in diminishing trade and our people's right to live and work across Europe.
But the Tory who wrote House of Cards warned the House of Lords they could imperil their future.
And there are some who let their honest ambitions slip and openly talk outside the House of sabotaging Brexit. That, my lords, is sad and unwise. They won't sabotage Brexit, but they might very well sabotage the credibility of this House. Our House is not well loved. Our support amongst MPs is falling. There are many in the press who are waiting with sharpened knives, particularly after the Data Protection Bill, to slit our veins.
Perhaps the strongest speech, though, came from one of David Cameron's Etonians, a former Brexit minister under Theresa May, who begged her to declare her Brexit vision.
The government must be honest with themselves and the public about the choices we face. And then the Prime Minister and her cabinet must make those choices. As has been said, to govern is to choose. And as we face the biggest challenge this country has faced since the Second World War, keeping every option open is no longer an option.
So trouble ahead in both Lords and Commons, as tonight Labour looks set very soon, just as it did last year, to force a Commons vote which would oblige ministers to publish these Brexit forecasts in full.
Well, from the House of Commons, the leading Brexiteer, Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg, chair of the European Research Group, a Brexit-supporting pressure group within the Tory party, consisting, we believe, of around 50 MPs, including some in the cabinet. Do you agree that Theresa May is being too vague about Brexit, that she needs to close down some of these options?
Well, I think Mrs May has set out some very clear parameters in the Lancaster House speech, in the Conservative Party manifesto, and in her Florence speech. I think the difficulty is that in the last week or so, there's been some vagueness coming particularly from the Chancellor of the Exchequer about staying in a customs union and the high degree of regulatory alignment. And his freelancing approach is undermining the unity of the government, and I think that is most unfortunate.
I mean, you say he's freelancing. Boris Johnson was on about NHS funding and a huge manifesto for what he wanted. I mean, they're all freelancing, aren't they?
No, Boris Johnson is the Foreign Secretary, and it's perfectly reasonable for him to set out a vision for Brexit, which is entirely in line with what the government has said.
For the NHS?
Well, that was something that was campaigned for by Leave campaigners.
It was freelancing, though,
and
wasn't
it would be very odd of Mr. Johnson to have moved away from what he said during the campaign. That's just a reiteration of a well-known point. What the Chancellor is doing is trying to break new policy ground without the support of the Cabinet, and this is against the constitutional norm of collective responsibility.
Well, you said today that Philip Hammond is now semi-detached member of the Cabinet. Would you rather if he was detached?
That's not for me to say. That's a judgment for the Prime Minister, and though he may not abide by...
It's not for you to say he's semi-detached either, is it?
No, it's perfectly reasonable for me to say that, but it's not for me to advise the Prime Minister on who she asks to be in Her Majesty's government. I think, though the Chancellor doesn't observe the constitutional norms, it's probably best that I should. OK, you said that Britain will be a vassal state under the proposed transitional phase, that Europe says we have to sign up to all the rules if we want all the benefits. Do you think it's better to be a vassal state or to stay in Europe as a full member during this period while we negotiate our future status? Well, I think that's a rather have you stopped beating your wife question.
Yeah,
I don't think either of those are good options. And I think you need to remember, and it's very important, that the EU's list of demands is their opening gambit in a negotiation. It's not Holy Writ, it's not tablets handed down to Moses. They have set out what they want, and it is open to us to negotiate with them and say, well, we're going to give you £39 billion at the end of this process. In return, we want a transition period that means we don't accept new laws from the European Union that we haven't voted on. We don't accept the judgments of the European Court of Justice, and most certainly we don't accept the free movement of people during the interim stage.
And if they say no to that, well, would you prefer to leave completely or to stay in the European Union while we continue to negotiate?
Well, I agree with the Prime Minister, who has consistently said that no deal is better than a bad deal, and I think it would be a mistake, and this is not the government position as well, a mistake to continue the negotiations after the 29th of March 2019. The point of the transition/implementation period is to implement an agreed position, not to carry on with detailed negotiations.
So on the government's current position, you would vote against the government, wouldn't you? I mean, you would vote to hard Brexit rather than accept this deal.
Well, the government hasn't accepted this deal yet. That so far we've had the EU's position set out, the demands by the 27, the negotiating mandate given to Mr. Barnier.
Well, if it does, let's assume it does, will you vote against it?
Well, I think the government would be quite wrong to kowtow to the demands set out on Monday by the European Union. That this is a negotiation. In any negotiation, you offer counter-proposals. You say, you're asking for acceptance of new EU laws, we're saying that's something we can't do. And then you come to an agreement. So I don't think why you should offer this either-or alternative of leaving without a deal or accepting their terms as dictated.
Well, the point is, if you don't agree with whatever the government's position ends up as, regarding the transitional period, if it's not good enough for you, are you prepared to vote against it?
Well, that's a statement of the obvious. All MPs are here to exercise their judgment on any piece of legislation that comes before them. And if they think that legislation is not in the national interest, they would vote against it. But that's not a piece of news. That's just the standard position.
But it raises a very interesting possibility, which is that Labour, for its own reasons of the deal not being close enough to Europe, and Eurosceptics such as yourself, who think it's too close, could unite to bring down whatever this deal is?
I think this is a highly unlikely circumstance because I expect the government to be able to negotiate successfully and show that it will not merely roll over and have its tummy tickled by the European Union.
Highly unlikely, but not impossible.
Well, nothing's impossible, and it's unwise to make statements of hypothetical situations that may or may not arise that box one in completely. But I very much doubt the circumstance you're outlining will arise.
OK. Now, I introduced you as the chairman of the ERG, the European Research Group. I interviewed your predecessor, Suella Fernandez, about who the research group is. And she wouldn't tell me. Will you tell me? Who do you represent? Who are your members?
Well, there are two parts to the European Research Group. We have a small inner group who combine to have some research on European matters. So we get briefings on bills that are coming before Parliament. When I was on the European Scrutiny Committee, I received weekly briefings on the information coming before us from the researcher, and on the Exiting the European Union Committee, I received briefings on the issues coming before me for that. And that's an inner subscribing group. And then there is a larger group of people who are broadly Eurosceptic and sympathetic to the government's position.
Will you publish the list of MPs?
Well, the list fluctuates, that it's not a list of people who are always
we can read it every week.
I think the bureaucracy of providing weekly list would be tasked.
No, but this is a matter of public interest because the public funds your group, doesn't it? Public money funds the ERG.
Patience, and I will tell you. The list of people who subscribe is available because they make declarations through IPSA. That's public information. You can find that out if you want to do so. That's not difficult. The group that I'm talking about beyond that is one that some weeks will have some people on it, then they may go into ministerial office and not be available, or others may join us. So that's the names that
Do you have cabinet ministers who are currently in your group?
We have cabinet ministers who are sympathetic.
Are they members?
You'll have to check the IPSA list to see if any are subscribers.
What about ministers?
I don't know offhand. I haven't got the list in front of me. But this isn't secret. This is available on the IPSA website. You can look it up. You've got teams of researchers at Channel 4 who in a few minutes could find this out.
Well, we look forward to you helping us with the other list, the list who don't declare the donations of public money that they give, but nonetheless give you support.
Oh, hold on. Anybody who gives money, anyone who is subscribing to the researcher has to, anyone who's subscribing to the researcher has to declare that publicly.
But it's the supporters who don't have to declare it, who you keep secret.
Well, we're not keeping them secret, but it's just a list that waxes and wanes. And a lot of people within the Conservative Party are sympathetic to the ERG. We don't actually have a formal membership list beyond those who are subscribers in that way. We just have a lot of people who are sympathetic, and what they're sympathetic to is to getting government policy implemented. Lancaster House, the manifesto, and getting cheaper food, clothing and footwear, especially for the poorest people in our society, by leaving the customs union. That's what they want.
Thank you very much indeed.
Great pleasure, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Well, tonight there's been a bit of a kerfuffle over the UKIP leader Henry Bolton's academic qualifications. Michael Crick was at the heart of it, and he has more. Michael, what have you sniffed out?
Well, you'll recall, Cathy, how last year the previous UKIP leader, Paul Nuttall, ran into big problems over embellishments to his past record. Well, now Henry Bolton, the current very beleaguered leader, has some similar problems. Yesterday, I asked Mr. Bolton how it was on the LinkedIn website, where people can advertise their experience and qualifications, how it was on the website that, as you can see here, he claims to have a BA from Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, in military studies, and also on his site claimed to have a BA in leadership and management from City and Guilds, when neither institution, Sandhurst nor City and Guilds, actually gives out degrees. Well, tonight, Henry Bolton has changed his LinkedIn site. He no longer claims to have a BA from Sandhurst, and on the entry from City and Guilds, he's still claiming a BA, but he's clarified that that's really an NVQ level 6, which City and Guilds say is the equivalent of a degree. Mr. Bolton says he's claiming it's a degree because people in the EU and at the UN will only understand it if he says it's a BA. They won't understand what an NVQ level 6 is.
Michael, thanks for clearing that up.
Now, most people go through sporadic phases of respecting the House of Lords or hating it, depending on whether its last important vote aligned with their own opinion. So be ready for a lot of discussion about the constitutional role of the Lords now it has started debating the EU withdrawal bill. Its Brexit discussions got going today. Lots of peers are down to speak, and of course, there are fears by some Brexiteers that the Lords could try simply to delay or thwart the whole thing. So, will the Lords do that? Our political editor has been investigating what the anti-Brexit peers are up to.
It's a gilded palace whose grand halls and corridors have echoed down the ages to the footsteps of monarchs and aristocrats as they shaped our island story. Now, as the UK embarks on a new journey, the Elysian fields of the House of Lords are serving as the last redoubt of pro-Europeans determined to challenge Brexit. If you were to delve into the minds of the 800 or so peers sitting across the river in one of the world's largest parliamentary chambers, you would find deep misgivings about Brexit. Most peers will say that reversing Brexit is the last thing on their minds. But one told me privately, "Of course, I'm trying to obstruct Brexit." It was just over a century ago that peers ended up relinquishing many of their powers after a seismic battle with the elected chamber over David Lloyd George's People's Budget. Today's peers have been warned that if they overstep the mark on Brexit, they could revive the people versus peers battle. One veteran would be delighted if a challenge to the government over Brexit led to the demise of the House of Lords.
This place is a complete anachronism. We send young men and women abroad to fight for democracy. We haven't even got it in our own country. The House of Lords, as it presently is how do you become a Lord? There's only two ways of doing it. One is that you're a friend of the Prime Minister, and the other is your great-grandmother slept with a king. I'm not entirely sure which of those provides the better peers. It's an anachronism. We need an elected second chamber, though that's not the battle we should be fighting at this stage.
So a more subtle game is being mapped out in the House of Lords. I understand that for the last few months, pro-European peers from the four main groups, the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats and the non-party crossbenchers, have been talking about how they can use the bill to assert the overall authority of Parliament and even to change the nature of Brexit. These pro-European peers hope to amend the bill in four ways. Firstly, challenge the use of so-called Henry VIII clauses, powers taken by ministers to put thousands of EU regulation into UK law without a full vote. Second, to remove any mention of the Brexit date of the 29th of March 2019, potentially turning the two-year transition period into an extension of the Article 50 negotiations. Then, to have a go at reintroducing amendments rejected by MPs to keep the UK in the single market and the customs union. But their highest hopes rest on tightening a rebel amendment passed in the House of Commons that would give Parliament a meaningful vote on the final stage, whatever the outcome. That would mean a vote, even if there's no deal. One peer is so concerned about the proposed transition phase, she hopes to see an extension of the Article 50 negotiations.
If we have extended Article 50, rather than going into this transition where we've left with no way back, then there would still be the option of protecting the national interest if it turns out that the consequences of where we're heading are far more dangerous and damaging than people might previously have realised.
Brexit supporting MPs believe unelected peers should tread with care.
Well, I would hope very much that the wisdom that sits in the House of Lords will know that fighting the people's voice would not be the way forwards, and that they should not be thwarting the process of this bill, but discussing it with them, kicking around the issues as we have done in the Commons, raising those concerns and then sending it back to the House of Commons so that we can take it through to royal assent.
The scene is set for a very British showdown in the Riverside Royal Palace. Peers are determined to carry out their constitutional duty to revise legislation, even if that involves a fight.
Nick Watt there. Nick joins me now because it's been a busy old day on the Brexit front, and Nick, not least because of a much discussed speech in that opening day of the House of Lords.
That's right. Well, there were high expectations of punchy interventions by peers this afternoon in the Lords, and so it proved when Lord Bridges, who was a Brexit minister until just before the general election, stood up. This is what the Remain supporting peer had to say.
All we hear day after day are conflicting, confusing voices. If this continues, and ministers cannot agree among themselves on the future relationship the government wants, how can this Prime Minister possibly negotiate a clear, precise heads of terms of the future relationship with the EU. My fear is that we will get meaningless waffle in a political declaration in October. The implementation period will not be a bridge to a clear destination. It will be a gangplank into thin air.
Now, the significance of that intervention is Lord Bridges is saying publicly what many ministers are saying privately, that there is a real potential danger to the UK negotiating position because Theresa May and the Cabinet have not yet been able to pinpoint the precise and exact nature of what they want
asking for
the future relationship to be.
As if to make that point, the other story today was this leaked document, BuzzFeed had it, on the economic impact of leaving. All scenarios not particularly good, I suppose you'd say, and that's caused division.
That's right. So we had another insight into the unease in government, and this sort of spilled it out into the open after the leak of that report. Now, Steve Baker, who's the Brexit minister, earlier today in the House of Commons, he said to MP that civil service forecasts are, as he said, always wrong. But now this evening, Dr. Philip Lee, who is a Justice Minister, has done a series of tweets in which he has said, you cannot just dismiss the evidence. And then look what he said in his second tweet. He said, but if these figures turn out to be anywhere near right, there would be serious questions over whether a government could legitimately lead a country along a path that the evidence and rational consideration indicate would be damaging. This shows the Prime Minister's challenge. Now, it is important to say that the government view...
Just to be clear, he's a minister in the government.
Who is Theresa May's neighbouring MP and has known her since before he was an MP. But it is important to say the government is saying that the scenarios that were being examined are the known scenarios. That report did not model the government's preferred option, a bespoke option, but obviously it can't be seen because they haven't outlined what they want yet.
Nick, thank you very much.
Brexit story once again hitting at least some headlines tomorrow. There's the Daily Express's take on it. Secret plot to derail Brexit. What's the secret plot?
It's a mad headline in that it's not a secret and it's not a plot to derail Brexit. But other than that, that headline of secret plot to derail Brexit seems perfectly... It's jibber-jabber even by the standards of the Express, which are peculiarly, almost parodically low. And so the problem... This is a story, and you can take issue with the leaked documents, if you like, which come from civil servants in Whitehall, explaining that the various different versions of Brexit will leave Britain worse off over the next 15 years. You can decry economists' inability to come up with accurate positions over history. You can say projecting 15 years into the future is a fool's game. There are legitimate debates to be had about that. It's not a secret. It's just...
Well, it's not been released, has it?
But this really is a non-story. It was a story that was leaked to BuzzFeed and is now kind of doing the rounds. But of course, we know that Whitehall, the civil service, we know that they largely remain. They don't want us to leave the European.
Do we know that?
Yeah, we do generally. Oh. Yes, of course we do. The part.
How do we know that?
Well, because we hear it regularly. But what, do you want names of people?
Well, how do we know that? How do we know that these people who wrote this are predominantly?
Let me carry on what I'm saying. So these people who are writing the story are not. They may be, quote, experts, but they're certainly not the kind of experts that are in the World Bank and what was the other organisation, the OECD, and all these financial institutions that have made these predictions over the past year since Brexit, saying that it's Armageddon. They've all been proved to be wrong. Every single one of them, by a mile, they've been proved to be wrong. So why would we think that a report that's been produced in Whitehall would suddenly be read? How can you predict 15 years ahead? The OECD and the World Bank couldn't predict a year ahead, so I don't know how they're going to predict 15 years.
It's a report that's come out of the Department for Exiting the EU by a bunch of civil servants whose job requires them to be impartial, and they've looked at economic evidence to suggest here are some reasons.
What economic evidence are they looking at? They can predict 15 years.
Well, even if... I mean...
It's nonsense.
they're predicting, for what it's worth, the 3 different scenarios.
They are, yeah.
And they're saying that the best one of those, which is effectively remaining in the European Union by all chance...
By the single market, get away, that's a 2...
It would be 2% down
But
growth.
but listen to some of the predictions they're saying. They're saying that if we go to WTO rules with no deal, 15 years down the line, the economy will be 8% worse off. If we stay in the single market, we'll be 2% worse off. If we go to a Canadian-type deal, we'll be 5% worse off. They cannot possibly know that at this stage. And all these screams for... I wish they would publish this thing, because it'll be slated just like all the other things, the IMF reports and the World Bank reports.
Isn't it not the case, though, Carol, I think that
they'll be slated.
People didn't vote Brexit, generally speaking, in my view, for economic reasons. You speak to a lot of Brexiteers, they are willing...
The main reason a poll last week said it wasn't immigration, it was actually wanting to govern ourselves.
Yeah.
That was the main reason.
Sovereignty. My point is, it's always been politics versus economics. There's always been a sense that there is a big trading bloc very close to us. It obviously makes economic sense. It self-evidently makes economic sense to be close to that trading bloc. As you pull yourself away from that trading bloc, there are going to be economic consequences. I'm not saying anything here that's not kind of self-evidently obvious. Now, people who voted Brexit would say, whatever turbulence that period causes, it may be we lose growth of 2%, 3%, 4%. We're already the slowest growing economy in Europe, thanks to the ramifications of the last...
faster than all these so-called experts said we were going to grow.
But still slow, but still slower than other people in Europe.
Yeah, but we've grown 1.8% this year, and when the predictions were 1.2%. So all these great experts don't know what they're...
All my point was that very few people who believe in Brexit would say, over the next 5 years, we'll do better economically as a result of Brexit. They will say, we're willing to pay a price for Brexit.
Well, Brexiteers said we would pay a price. They said exactly that. There would be hiccups for the first couple of years, but then
so you're saying the same thing there?
So I kind of effectively believe this is saying no more than the bleeding obvious, which is when you pull out of a preferential trade deal with a giant block of partners which are right on your doorstep, there's going to be economic consequences.
But the world has become smaller in terms of how we get to it and how we access it. So it's easier to do deals out there than it ever was before. Of course it is. In the Commonwealth, it's easier to do deals now than it's ever been.
It's still
easier to do deals with America. We do deals with America.
It's still easier to do deals with things that are right next to you. And all I'm saying is...
fighting with them and the people in this country don't want to be in it.
All I'm saying, the economic consequences of Brexit were not the reason why people voted for Brexit. They voted for other reasons. Like you said, maybe it was immigration, but I totally buy...
No, it wasn't. It was, well, there was a big poll of 12,000 people that just came out recently that said the main reason... It was an Lord Ashcroft poll that said the main reason was sovereignty.
Yeah, and I totally buy that, and that's fine. But we can't then kid ourselves by saying there won't be negative economic consequences, or even that people are willing to pay economic consequences. That's exactly... And so this effectively says, here are some projected figures that show what their consequences might be. I'm not sure anyone would actually dispute that.
Projected figures that are nowhere near
as smart. And Theresa May also says this is not the kind of deal we're looking for anyway, that has been looked at. There are 3 different scenarios, none of which is the one we want, which is a bespoke deal.
Yeah, but Theresa May, of course, has no clue, first beginnings of a clue of what she actually wants. The government hasn't got the first beginnings of a clue, so the government can't really say, and this is the great irony here, the government says this doesn't take into account our own plans, because you haven't got any plans. Actually, it can't take into account the things that don't exist.
Lord Bridges today said in the Commons that the first thing we have to decide is what kind of country we want after Brexit, and I actually totally agree with that.
So do you think everything's been done the wrong way round? Yeah. Given the divisions currently that Theresa May is contending with, she's on her way to China, leaving behind rats in a sack in her party.
She never, no one talks of Brexit. No one, all the things that we're saying that are good about what might happen is not being talked up. Theresa May will not talk it up for fear of offending the people who are against Brexit. She is, I really think now this country is rudderless. I used to kind of want her to succeed. I thought she might succeed with Brexit, but I really think now that the first part of Brexit has happened. I think the second part has to be taken over by somebody who actually knows where we're going.
A different subject, but
I was going to say the other point that's the elephant in the room here is, of course, this is not all within our gift, because we've said we're leaving the EU, and therefore it's what the EU is willing to grant us as well. So we can talk about what Britain's position will be. Britain's position, to a certain extent, is also whatever the EU will let it be.
OK, we're turning actually to that front page, but it was the other half of the page that you wanted to focus on. They've done a quote from their comment section about what's going on in the House of Lords at the moment.
Yeah, had the House of Lords been an echo chamber for Brexit, then I don't think the Daily Mail would be constitutionally concerned about it. But as the House of Lords has displayed a willingness to challenge the terms of Brexit and to express criticism of it, the Mail is constitutionally concerned about it. It feels it's for a bunch of bemoaning has-beens who are just using the opportunity to waste everyone's time and chunter on. And that, in leaving aside
and that's
Brexit...
exactly what they're doing.
Well, leaving aside Brexit, that's not a terrible description of the House of Lords more generally. But the Mail doesn't like it because there's a 2-day debate in the House of Lords. It's a chance for everyone in the House of Lords, and they've more or less almost all taken it.
They are queuing up, aren't they?
And say their 2 bits.
This is not just
Brexit.
about the Mail not liking it. This is a whole bunch of unelected people sneering at the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit. Listen to something. This is Lord Bill Moria. He's my co-host on The Pledge. He says, Brexit is a train crash in slow motion. He said, my lords, it's not too late to stop the train crash. Lord Higgins said the Leave campaign was riddled with lies. Hello, the Remain campaign was riddled with lies and doomsday, Armageddon lies. Lord Butler says the first line of the bill to repeal the European Communities Act strikes the dagger to my soul.
None of that's sneering,
yes, they are sneering.
That's not sneering, that's just disagreeing.
They're saying yes, it is. And Mandelson as well, who we know has been to Brussels to talk down Brexit, to actually help support them to overturn Brexit in Brussels. He's saying the government cannot behave as if it has a blank cheque to take Britain out. It isn't doing that. But again, it isn't doing that.
That's the problem in this whole...
These are unelected people.
That's a separate
argument. The Brexit vote was the biggest democratic vote in this country, and how dare they try to overturn it?
I think the problem is that you can, in this whole debate, a disagreement about the merits of either Brexit itself or the manifestations of Brexit, which are still all to play for in the sense the government has not the first beginnings of an idea what it wants to do. If everything is couched as either a sneer or a cheer...
It is sneering.
It places a moral judgment on something which could just be intelligent people having a disagreement on a set of disputable points. And this is a series of disputable points.
A whole load of privileged people who think they know better than the masses.
But I guess the role of the House of Lords is, whether you may have an argument over the fact that it's unelected, its role is to be a check on the House of Commons.
The role of civilised society is to argue that sort of thing.
From day one, from the day that the vote was announced, they have made it clear that they don't agree with it and they don't want it, and they'll do everything in their power to overturn it. And that's precisely what they're doing now.
I don't actually think they're going to overturn it. And many of them actually have gone out of their way today to say it's not their job to overturn.
What they said again, we respect the will of the people. No, they don't.
Well, they respect the fact of the decision, but they can argue. And if everything is a sneer, anyone who challenges Brexit, anyone who looks at the future and says there are serious concerns about when we extricate ourselves from a very complicated trade agreement with something that's very close to us and head out into the great blue yonder, helmed actually by a government that doesn't know what they're doing, and expresses concern that that might affect the economic well-being of the country and therefore its poorest inhabitants. Anyone who expresses those views, if they're always characterised as sneering...
So, no, let me tell you what's sneering. Quentin Letts doesn't name the person. He said, one quivering old fool called for the Brexit referendum, the biggest vote in our country's history, to be ignored because we didn't know what we were doing. You can't call for a democratic vote to be ignored just because you feel like
welcome to the House of has-beens, old fools and businessmen.
Most of them are.
I don't object. That's sneering. My point is, you must be entitled to disagree with various manifestations of Brexit.
And they also want to ban referenda in the future in case the masses make yet another stupid decision.
What would you like to have a referendum on in the future?
Well, who knows what I want, but I don't want it to be banned just because people in the House of Lords thought this one we made a bad decision on. But more importantly, we were talking in the part before, we were talking about how when I said Remainers are among the civil servants who've leaked this report predicting nothing but Brexit gloom. It turns out that Cabinet Secretary Sir Jeremy Haywood...
This is the Sun, page 2.
This is the Sun, page 2. Who was an arch Remainer, is said to have played a key role in coordinating this paper. It says this dossier was drawn up without Minister's permission. So he went ahead and ordered this. And what's he going to order? Good news?
Well, according to David Davis, there are a series of impact papers. Then there weren't a series of impact papers. Of course there's going to be impact papers written by impartial civil servants to examine what might happen in the future.
Without Minister's permission, without Minister's knowledge, and actually coordinated by Cabinet Secretary Jeremy Haywood, who does not want Brexit to happen.
And we should explain a bit more about this report,
So this report, yes. This is a report that has come out of government. It's come out of various departments.
And it's been leaked.
And it's been leaked to BuzzFeed. And what it shows is there are 3 different versions of Brexit modelled in this. One is pretty much remaining in the single market and the customs union. That would hit the growth of our economy by 2%. There's the World Trade Association, the fallback option, which I think hit by 8%. Every option that they're looking at will affect
and what they're
damage our
doing,
growth.
and this is stupidity because they can't do it. They're looking 15 years ahead and predicting these losses. You know, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD tried to predict 2 years ahead, and they made a complete mess of it.
How many?
They made a complete mess of it, and they got it entirely wrong, and have had to apologise. How can these civil servants predict 15 years ahead?
No,
they can't.
As far as I'm aware, very, very few people on the Brexit side of the argument believe there will be a zero impact on the economy.
No, because we all believe there will be.
Right.
But you think it's a price worth paying?
But
that's my point.
But I don't believe it's going to be an 8% loss on the economy over 15 years. And even if it is, these people can't possibly know that.
So all I'm saying is, if even the Brexit lot believe there's going to be an economic damage...
But we always said there was going to be an economic hit.
I'm not questioning that. All I'm saying is, this is just simply a bunch of people who are economists, who work for central government...
Well, they're not all economists.
But they're relying on the information of economists who work for central government, are just trying to put a figure on the scale of the potential damage. If everyone accepts that this is going to have economic damage for us in the short term, and a load of people think, great, that's worth paying, I'm happy for the government...
When you put a figure on it, like an 8% slowdown of the economy, that's not just saying there's going to be a bit of economic damage. That's saying it's going to be catastrophic. And they can't possibly
Well, I just want to show another front page just to illustrate this. This is the Express page 1, just to show that lots of papers are covering this. So does it mean now that we shouldn't do economic forecasting at all?
Well, people can do it till the cows come home, but don't depend on it to make any big decisions, because, you know, if there are armies of well-paid experts in the World Bank, in the OECD, in the IMF get it wrong constantly, which they do.
What is the basis for making decisions?
Let me finish. Every prediction they've made has been proved wrong about Brexit. So if that is the case, don't base this country's future on them.
So what impact could this leaked report have, do you think, on public sentiment, given Carol's point that some of the predictions made by the Remainers don't appear so far
I think the public sentiment...
The impact this lot wanted to have is to put us off, because what they want to do is either have a soft Brexit or no Brexit at all.
I mean, there's no evidence, really, of public sentiment really shifting
It's about the same. It really is about
a vast
the same.
deal.
Yeah.
The problem that the government has, this is why it's catastrophic, really, for the government, is these economic forecasts exist. The government can't turn around and say, aha, here is our plan, here is the sort of Brexit we want, here is the work we've done under David Davis, for example, that will determine the sort of Brexit we want. Let's even leave aside the fact that it's not in our gift, because we're saying we're leaving the EU whatever happens, and so the EU will have a say in the negotiation, but the government has no grip on this. So it can't turn to anyone, the dissenters or the people in support of it, and say, this is the Brexit that we're looking for. So this is economic data.
And there I agree with them, actually, sadly.
We better move on then.